This is a new recording. It was recently brought to the attention of the editorial department by Mr. Arthur R. Shoemaker of Hominy, also a member of the Oklahoma Historical Society, that the construction of the Keystone Dam on the Arkansas River near the town of Keystone, Oklahoma, will completely inundate the Keystone town site and the surrounding area, in which there are many points of historic interest. As a result of further correspondence on this, Mr. and Mrs. Adrian Swift, who have lived in Keystone for 30 years, arranged a meeting in their home where a number of old-timers gathered to make a tape recording of their memories to be preserved for this history. The meeting was held in Keystone on Saturday afternoon, March 9, 1957, and the following recording made with Mr. Swift serving as moderator.
Your name?
Reed Ackley.
And the next member of our discussion group today for the historical events of Keystone will be Art
Stoneman.
And
Calvin Hubbard. T.W. Doug.
Salina O'Keefe.
now let's see if that come in all right.
No.
I want to make some preliminary remarks on this thing to tell what it's all about. Yeah, they get carried all the way through. Now, Jack, following the statements that we have had here, we have our group lined up that is to discuss the historical background of Keystone. We have here today from the Oklahoma Historical Society two representatives who has gone to a lot of trouble to drive up here to help make the recording and to write the history of this community. Miss Muriel Wright and Miss Catherine Ringland. And on my left, as we have them seated, are some of our so-called native people, old neighbors and friends of mine, of course. Mr. Reed Ackley, Mr. Art Stoneman, Mr. Cal Hubbard, Mr. Tommy Duff, and Miss Salina O'Keefe, who is a sister of Mr. Duff. The purpose of this recording and the purpose of making the notes for the historical background relates, of course, to the construction of the Keystone Dam. The Congress has appropriated the first money for the construction, and the clearing of the dam site is actually underway as of this date. Some property appraisals have been made as of March 1957, and according to the plans of the engineers, the construction will be underway by July or perhaps August of this year. Now, we would like to try to establish as authentically as possible the beginning of the town, the establishment of the first post office, the first stage line, and the first crossing of the Cimarron on the ferry boat, and such things as that. So let's make it as informal as we possibly can and step over here to Mrs. O'Keefe and her brother Tommy. I see that they were discussing the pictures of an old schoolhouse and the enrollment there. Mrs. O'Keefe, could you and Tommy relate some of the people that you recognize in the picture and give the date of it? And get her.
I think this was about when I was 8 or 9 years old when this picture was taken, and it was an old log schoolhouse on what we call the Dry Lake School across the river in old Appalachia. And I believe I can name practically all the students that were in this group. Armina Marshall, Bertha Steptoe, Myrtle Steptoe, Lauren Steptoe, Florence Pogue, Archie Duck, Fred Duck, Grace O'Brien, Tommy,
Durham.
Porter, Francis Zickafoos, Zeta Zickafoos, Nora Van Pelt, Harrison Van Pelt, Arthur Duck, Denver Adrian, Harley Bean, and Harrison Van Pelt.
Well, that's very good. Is that all of them?
That was all that was in our school group at that time. And
Well-
our teacher's name was Miss Brooks.
And that was about what year, Mrs. O'Keefe?
Well,
Do you remember, Tommy, what year the school was first established?
The age from your age would be with.
Well, do you recall who the first teacher was? Now, Nick,
The first teacher at Dry Lake was Miss Van Pelt.
is this the same school that Nick Zickafoos taught school in?
Charlie Zickafoos. I have a picture of Charlie Zickafoos' school the next year following this one.
Well, wasn't Nick Zickafoos a teacher too at one
No,
time?
no.
Well, I'm all mixed up in that.
No, it's Charlie, his uncle.
All right, now we have the establishment of the what you call the Dry Lake School,
Dry Lake School.
beginning about the year of 1900 and what? You have a recollection on that?
96. About 1903, I'd think.
About 1903. Well, now we've got the cart before the horse just a little bit here. We've established a school before we established a town. So let's go over to Cal Hubbard. And Cal, can you tell us the year that you think, as close as you can, for the first establishment of Keystone?
Well, it was July 12th, 1903.
Do you recall any of the original town site owners or promoters? Was it Dr. Reeder?
No.
Was it Frank Chesley?
Well, I don't remember about this town over here, this side over here. I'm talking about the other side.
Well, is that Keystone or Appalachia?
Appalachia.
Well, that was Appalachia establishment.
Yeah,
Was it
1903.
ahead of Keystone?
No.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Appalachia was ahead of Keystone.
Well,
this town was over here when we came down here. Finally, they called Appalachia Keystone, included it all together.
well, now this is the very purpose of our discussing these things, is to see if we can have a meeting of the minds, even though we have a little differences of opinion from a way back as to which place was established first, Appalachia or Keystone. Now, Reed, what is your recollection of it?
Well, I thought Appalachia was established first, then when the railroad come through here, it was moved over here.
Well, and now, in 1903, when I first came down here, why, the first dinner I had was old S.K. Bean on the other side on his farm.
Was that Harley Bean's father?
Uh-huh.
He was a homesteader.
Yeah, I guess so.
Was Harley Bean a homesteader
No,
or his father?
his father.
Uh,
That was his home.
Well, in trying to establish now, perhaps Keystone, what's the earliest date that you recall the first houses that were built on the south side of the river?
Well, let's see, I don't know. There was only 2 houses on this side of the river when I came down there in the Reeder Hotel.
Well, what houses
One
were
was
those?
Henry Mott, or, no, what's the old man's name?
Sim.
Mott.
Sim.
Mott.
Sim Mott.
Sim Mott.
Is that right, Art? And then Frank Chesley? Frank Chesley and Sim Mott had built homes here. And Dr. Reeder had built the hotel, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was 1900 and...
Well, that was before I came down here.
I mean, your first time here, when those places were already established, was 1903. Is that right?
Yeah, they were here then.
Uh-huh. Well, let's take the microphone over to Mr. Stoneman now, and see if we can get some connection between the establishment of Keystone and the time that his father homesteaded in section 2820 North 9 East. I think I have that description right, do I not, Arch?
That's right, 28.
It was section 28, township 20 North, range 9 East.
I forgot the range.
And your father homesteaded there in what year?
1893.
1893. That was the year of the opening, of course, of the Cherokee Strip. Did he make the run?
Yeah, made the run.
And how many of the family were here at that time, Arch?
Well, mother and father and 3 brothers and a sister.
And he took them all with you, with him, when the guns went off for the big race of the opening of the Strip, or did he go alone to set out his stake?
No, Adrian, let me talk a while.
Fine, good.
When it come time to make the race, these boys was camped out on a Baker Creek out about 3 miles south of Keystone, what was called Boomertown. There was a bunch of families that moved in there and was waiting for the Strip to open. The morning of the opening, they got on the best horses they could big boy or steal and got ready to make the race. And some of them started from down here right about where the rock is in Keystone. Some of them started from up here about the Isles filling station. And my father and his bunch started up about north of the underpass between Keystone and Mandarin. And at 12 o'clock they made the run into the Strip and staked their claims.
Well, they were originally camped out then in the Creek Nation.
Yeah, Creek Indian Territory.
Creek Indian Territory. And Reed, do you recall where your father started when he made the run into the Strip?
I don't believe he made the run. I believe it was the next day after the run. He was acquainted with the country in there. He went out and staked his claim.
That was in the day following the opening of the
so.
Cherokee Strip.
Yes, I believe so.
Well, I was trying to establish his homesteading date there, Reed, because you recall that we drilled a well on your old home place about 35 years ago, and your father and your family all lived there at that time. Now let's go back to Mr. Hubbard. And if any of you want to contribute anything to this, let's try to establish the time of the opening of the first post office in Appalachia. Mr. Hubbard, can you give us something on that?
Let's see. I think it was about 1906. About 3 years after it opened up.
Tommy, do you have anything to add?
The first post office here was at Leroy, and after the town site was established, it opened up about, as he said, in 1906 at the Adrian Harness Shop.
In the Adrian Harness Shop. Was that the father of Bill Adrian or the grandfather?
The grandfather, the great, Toner Adrian's father opened, had the post office.
Not a
It'd be
Harness
his grandfather with it. Yeah.
Now that was in 1906.
About 1906, yes.
Then, do any of you recall when the first post office was established south of the river in Keystone? Mr. Stoneman?
No, I don't recall that.
Reed, do you have any recollection of that?
I'd say in the late 90s.
Well, what's this Appalachia and Keystone? There's a little bit of confusion there on my part. Where was Appalachia and where was Keystone? What side of the river and which river?
Well,
Cimarron or
Appalachia
Arkansas?
was on the north side of the Cimarron, and Keystone, as we know it now, of course, was established on the south, and later took in Appalachia, which included both sides of the river. But we're trying, if we could establish when this first post office was set up on the south side of the river, then we can establish what is the present town of Keystone and its original
Yes.
post office.
We could get that by making a little research and take that to old timers. I can't remember, but when Keystone, the first buildings was here, was just a very few, the Reader Hotel and Mott's Residence and a few other old timers on the south side. And this Appalachia you're talking about, that wasn't until after the 1900s sometime.
1902 when they sold the
1902.
lots.
Before that was
Mr. Stone, you remember the first building that was on the site of present-day Keystone. When was that, and who was it?
well, in 1890 there was an old ranchman lived right at the point of the mountain down here by the name of Moreland, and he run stock up towards Manford and all around through this country, and to my knowledge he was the first man that's here. Incidentally, he's the first man that's ever buried in a little cemetery here right in the west part of Keystone.
Mm-hmm. And there was no other settlements around?
No, there was no other houses anywhere close back up towards Baker Creek, while there was another house between Boomertown and there, as we called it, where the settlers was camped up there.
Where did you
Baker
get your
Creek.
mail in here?
Tulsi and Sapulpi.
How'd you get your mail?
Oh, went in a wagon or horseback whenever we thought it was necessary. Got it maybe once every 2 or 3 months.
Well, while we're here close to Reed Ackley, there is some mention in Mr. Wright, do you recall if it's A.G. Debo's book or Mr. Gould's book on the establishment of the ferry across the Cimarron?
Mr. Bo's book.
A.G. Debo records that Sherman Ackley, who is the father of Reed Ackley, who is here with us, operated a ferry crossing the Cimarron. Do you recall what year that was in, Reed?
No, that was Arkansas. His ferry boat was on the Arkansas.
Oh, your father ferried the Arkansas, not the Cimarron. Well, now that's helping to clear up some of these
before
things.
the strip opened.
Was that,
That-
north of the mouth of the Cimarron or down
It
the...
was south. It
south?
was where the
Da-
Tulsa County line is now.
Oh,
Downstream from the mouth of the Cimarron.
Yes,
where the Tulsa County line is
that's
today.
right.
Then
That
do
was
you,
the Ackley Ferry.
Yes, ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
do you
I
recall who
believe
was...
they called it the old U.S. ferry at that time.
Do you recall what year?
No, I don't.
You, Arch, you remember what year it
No, there
was?
was a ferry there before the strip opened 2 or 3 years. I'd say there's a ferry there. Wouldn't you, Reed?
Yeah, he was still running it when the strip opened.
Yeah, that ferry is probably established in
The latter 80s.
latter 80s, somewhere along when your folks come here, Reed. So,
I don't know.
They was here when we come here, and we come in '90, so it was sometime in the late '80s.
Mm-hmm.
I think the bootleggers used to ferry the Arkansas over there and stay all night in Sand Springs.
Yeah,
Mr. Stoneman, didn't you say that your father had to get permission to homestead or live in the Creek Nation?
well, there was that time you're supposed to get a permit from an Indian, but looking over his old papers, we've never been able to find any permit
Wide open.
for that. I think cost $4 or $5, $4, wasn't it?
Yes, about 4,
For
and
a
it
permit.
changed. Sometimes it was 5 later.
His first dealing with the Indians was with Archie Bruner and Bill Sapulpi down there, and he got acquainted with them, and as far as I know, he never got a permit, but we've not been able to find it in any of his papers if he did.
Now, Mr. Stoneman, you mentioned that they were your father and some of the people who came in here a little early were in Boomertown. Do you now? No doubt that is the beginning of Boomer Sooner. Which one of you can tell us something authentic about the origin of the Sooner part of Boomer Sooner? Any of you have anything? Either of you ladies from the historical department have anything on the Sooner part of the Boomer Sooner?
You mean the song?
No,
the
yes, the Boomer Sooner.
Well, probably it was when the proclamation was made to open the country. Certain people came in before the hour that was appointed and chose their land. And they were probably called the Boomer Sooners for that reason. They were booming the country and they came in before the hour.
You think they were booming and they came in a little sooner,
Yeah.
sooner, huh?
That's what I think. Now,
Well,
that's
the
my
Sooners
interpretation.
weren't really,
We all always thought that.
the people, as if I understand it correctly, who were settled in what they called Sooner settlements, were in perfectly legitimate spots to approach the Cherokee Strip for the run. Now, isn't that right?
Yes, yes. I suppose out in this region they would be camped across the line in the Creek Nation.
Yes, that's right.
And they'd have a right to be there. Probably had permits. Now, we don't have all those old records and papers, but evidently most of them that stayed in this country would have a permit. Well, then, of course, their friends gathered, and they wouldn't have time to have a permit. Maybe they'd been here just a few months. They'd be camped over in the Creek Nation. And then when the time came to make the run, they'd just go over into the area where they wanted to make their homestead or their claim.
That's right. Adrian, let's make that a little clearer about the boomers. Long before, when the Cherokee Livestock Association took all the Cherokee Strip over, why, they wanted to hold that naturally for pasture. And Payne and Couch and a few other men decided that it should be government land open to settlement, and they would take colonies. You call me down, miss, if I ain't right on this. And they would come into Oklahoma, and the soldiers would come and take them back to Kansas or take them out of the state. But what the boomer town you referred to a while ago, that was just what the people are waiting for the strip to open, and they had to be in the Indian Territory or Kansas. And when the proclamation was made, I think it was 90 days, is that correct?
It was in August. I think it was in August of 1893, and they run. It was a very short time, but they knew that it was coming, and they were ready for it.
And they wasn't supposed, none of these fellows wasn't supposed to go over and look for land or corners or anything for that time. But when the time come to run, some of them were so anxious that they would go over the night before and be there. Incidentally, there's a man sat just north of Keystone. I don't know who he was, on some high land. I seen him over there, and he waited till the men that was running crossed the river, and he started, and he had a half-mile start off him. I seen him. I don't know who he was. Might have been
Now, that is just what I wanted, Arch. Go ahead.
It might have been Adrian Swift.
No, I wasn't in on the opening down here. I was born in the Cherokee Indian Territory to the northeast of here.
Mr. Swift,
That's right.
I think that boomer then, the Payne, of course, and his men were booming for the central part of Oklahoma, and that name just held over for anybody that wanted to enter any of these areas that were opened at various times. They just held the name over as Boomer. But it came out of the 1880s when they would go across the Cherokee Strip down into the old Oklahoma country in the central part of the Indian Territory, the unassigned lands.
Well,
And
that's a very interesting bit of a sidelight to the historical events here.
Was in that,
I'd like to get over here to Mr. Duff and to his sister Salina and get some comment on the earliest date of the arrival of their father and the establishment of the farm where he brought his family into this immediate area. What year was that, Mr. Duff?
Well, we came to Oklahoma in 1896. And we landed right east across the river where John Anderson is now. 3 months later we come over and established on a school land. 3 years later than that, in about 1900, my father homesteaded 120 acres, which lays about a mile and a half north of Keystone now.
And how many members of the family at that time?
Father and mother and 6 children.
And
no, there was 5 children. My youngest brother was born in Oklahoma.
Here. And that was in
1896.
1896.
When we come. We established. He filed on the homestead in about 1900.
About 1900.
At that time, there was no railroads here, and the traffic got in here from Star Route, came from Perry to Tulsa.
Now that is exactly what we want to get on next, is your original stage line.
And that's right. and they stopped at, started Perry, stopped at Pawnee, and they changed horses here at Leroy.
Now
And
we
they run
speak
from
of-
Leroy to Tulsi.
When we speak of Leroy, to establish it so that people who do not know anything about Leroy, tell them where Leroy is with relation to Keystone, Mr. Duff.
Well, it's about 3 miles north of Keystone.
And there was a river crossing then to the east
The,
of Leroy,
The
or southeast.
the river crossing when we came here was across the Arkansas on a ferry north of the mouth of Cimarron.
Now that ferry
Right across
crossing,
from John Anderson's.
that would be a ferry crossing still north of the one that Sherman Ackley
That's right.
operated.
That's right.
Anything else to add to this, Salina?
No.
We had to drive with wagons at that time to Perry to prove up. And I remember making my trip with Dad, and he got sick, and I had to drive in the night all the way back, and I was 15 years old.
Well, that was known as the John Anderson Ferry, wasn't it?
Yeah. I don't know what it's called of it. No, it was the old Paul Myers. You remember Paul Myers?
Yes.
Well, that was Paul Myers Ferry. They lived over there.
Was that
Paul Meyer,
Meyer?
M-Y-E-R.
George Jack's is
That was some of Jake Moore's
that's right.
people.
His father was one of the
Paul
Myers
Myers out
boys,
here,
yeah.
wasn't
Oh, Phil Myers.
Phil Myers was Jack was his son, and this is Jakey, son to Jack.
All right, then the original stage didn't ford the river, it crossed on a ferry, is that right?
No, they forded whenever the river was down.
When the river was down, they always forded, and when it was up, they crossed on the ferry.
Was that a star route? Was that a star route for the mail? Was there?
Yes, Mom. They carried passengers. That's how my father got into this country. He landed in Perry and drove down here on that route.
It's what they
But
call
we
a star.
we come in through Claremore and Tulsa when we come. We come later.
But it was the original star
That's right.
route through the territory.
Run from Perry to Pawnee and to Cleveland and down to Leroy and then on down to Tulsa.
Well, we're going to have to cut this off for just a moment until I change the tape over. All of those from the changeover on tapes, and we were talking at the time about the mail, the original stage line. So we'll pick up here with you, Tommy, to see what we can add to it from the standpoint of who went in as the first postmaster or postmistress, as the case might have been. What do you have to add to that?
First postmistress at Leroy was Mrs. Lee Masters, and that's where the stage changed their mail, changed the horses on the way from Perry to Tulsa.
Was that Roy Lee Masters'
That's Roy Lee
mother?
Masters' mother.
Then do you know about how long after the establishment of the first post office at Leroy that a post office was established either at Appalachia or Keystone?
Well, that was in about 1902 or 3 when they first established in Appalachia. That was run by Mrs. Van Pelt, and it was in the Cal Hubbard building.
Yes, I believe Cal mentioned that this morning, but he didn't mention the name. That's
Yeah,
good
they-
that we got that. Miss
yeah.
Stevens, do you remember
I remember Mrs. Van Pelt very
Van
well.
Pelt in the post
She-
office at Appalachia?
Well, yes.
And then what about Keystone? Can we dig up anything further on that?
I don't remember when the post office was established at Keystone. In about 1903, they built the Katy Railroad on the east side of the Arkansas River. And then the mail was brought up by train and put off at the Appalachia Switch. And it was brought across the river by Bill Groot in a skiff. And then the star route was abandoned.
That was about what year?
That was about 1903, 2 or 3.
Well, do any of you recall the driver of any of the Star Route stages, or the drivers of any of the freight line transportation that was through here at the time? Now, I remember that Albert Bookout at one time drove a freight wagon. Can you add anything to that, Mr. Stoneman?
Joe Winsel carried from Tulsa to Senate. when they used to cross about Leroy.
About what year?
Well, somewhere, I don't remember the year, but one, about the first line that went through there, and went on up to Cleveland, I think, and Pawnee, that route.
Do any of you recall that William Cornstalk drove a freight wagon hauling freight in the area in the early days? You remember that, Ari?
No, I don't.
Well, Adrian, them days, you know, everybody had a team that was transportation nearly freighted. Some of them had bigger outfits than others, but most all the people hauled freight from Tulsa and Sapulpa over the years. Probably every young feller in the country did. One of the bigger freighters was a fellow by the name of Joe Hearn.
Is that the name from which Joe Hearn Holler, an area out here, was named, Art?
I guess it was. His boy out here, John Hearn, still lives at the old Senate place out there.
He's living there today.
Yeah.
Where is Senate?
It's 4 miles north.
Yeah, the old grist mill.
Northwest.
Senate is 4 miles northwest of the present town of Keystone.
Yeah, that's right.
About right. Then we have one other thing we'd like to get in here. The story has been told. How authentic it is, of course, I don't know, but I know that many of you will recall that in the early day, Keystone was pictured as pretty much of a bootleg center. What can we add to that? Do you know any of the detail of it? Tommy, do you remember any of the incidents or anything in connection with it?
Well, after the strip was opened, of course, booze was forbidden in the nation, the Creek Nation and the Osage Nation, and this being on the line made it a great center for to ship it in.
And where did it come from?
Well, I don't know.
Mostly from Missouri.
It was shipped in on a train.
It's coming on a train.
Yeah.
It was, how was that, all right? Now you tell us.
Come in on a train and shipped in here with a carload.
And unloaded here at Keystone on the
Unloaded
south
here.
side of the river.
And hauled to
That's a Frisco
Sapulpa
bill.
and Tulsa with teams.
Well, it seems to have been a very lucrative business in that day and time, even as it is now.
That's right. Oh yeah, a lot of people made their living here, just there at the depot, signing their name every day for a gallon of whiskey and a barrel of beer. That's what that's right.
Yeah,
Well, now,
that
who
was
would
business
take that?
at the
Where would they
time.
take that to?
Take it to Tulsa and Sapulpa.
Well, of course, it was a bootleg there, wasn't it?
Oh yeah.
It wasn't. It was against the law.
That's right.
But
Well, yes, it was all,
Indian territory. It was against the law, but
That
they
was
could
against the
do
law
it
there, but
here.
it was all right here. They could sign. You could sign up for 1 gallon of whiskey.
Yeah, we had saloons here till, when did they go out?
I don't know about.
well, they went
statehood.
out with statehood.
Yeah.
That's right.
1979.
Yes,
Up to
1907.
They had,
Do you recall Joe Weirman at one time having been a bartender here in Keystone?
Yes, I do.
I knew, of course, as all of us who are here today remember Joe and Lou Weirman.
that's right.
And they told me stories of it 35 years ago.
That's right.
And I think that perhaps that Keystone was a distribution center for whiskey going into the territories, even though
Being
it
right
was
here,
illegal.
you see, and like right here in the corner, here's Osage, and here's this. 200 yards over here is the Indian Territory, and here's Osage, and as Harry says, they bring it in by the bootleg, by the carload, and they take it by wagon load, and even took it boats and skiffs down the river. You know, the old boys used to get stuck there and have an awful time.
All right.
I wasn't with them that time.
Very good. Now I notice, Mr. Stoneman, you have a picture of an old-time school building with quite a number of students, and that dates back to about what year?
As well as I can remember, about 1894.
And the schoolhouse was located rather, at that time in what we know now as the East Basin.
Basin
Is that right?
On the old Sim Mott place.
Well, tell us all that you can recall about it, Arch.
Well, I don't recognize near all children here, but I could call a few of them. Ethel Patrick, Sylvia Baker, Terry Cole, Claude Adrian, Lou Mitchell, Bertha Daniels, George Mitchell, Bill Zickafu, Eleanor Baker, Harry Wiggs, Brady Mitchell, Elsie Wiggs, and John Baker, and Icy Mitchell. I believe that's about all agent that I know of.
Now we have added to our group here Mrs. Frances Zickafoos and Mr. and Mrs. R. Stevens. R., do you recall any of these
No, I didn't know
people in
any of
this
them over there.
school picture? Do you, Miss Stevens, do you recognize any of them?
In this picture,
Your father taught there the year before that was taken, but I don't know whether you was there or not.
no, but I didn't go to school over there that year. We lived across, over, down in the bottom of Keystone, and he rode a horse across the river over there to teach that school.
Oh, your father was the teacher
Yes, at that
in this
school.
building?
Uh-huh.
Well, that is very interesting. Ms. O'Keefe, do you recognize anyone in there that
No, I
Mr.
don't.
Stoneman didn't name?
Now, this was in a different district, you see.
Mhm.
It was in the Basin District, and we lived in the Keystone District, see.
Oh, yes. Well, that pretty well covers the history of the early day schoolhouses then. And we'll go now to Mrs. Zickafoos. And I think that she has a very interesting story to tell us, and a very authentic story. What year did your people first come here, Mrs. Zickafoos?
In 1882,
And what was their name?
Besser. My grandfather was one of the first doctors in here.
In the territory.
Yes, sir.
And what was his first name? Do you recall?
James T. Besser.
That was your
My grandfather.
your grandfather.
Yes, sir.
And he was the father. I'm trying to recall. I know most of your family. Bob and Bill and Gid. Am I right there?
Yes, sir. And Uncle Bob was the first white baby born in Tulsa.
Now that's Bob Besser that's still living here north of Keystone.
Yes, sir.
Was the first white child born in what is now the city of Tulsa.
Yes, sir.
That is an authentic record, and it's been established many, many times by historians.
Yes,
And
sir.
it's particularly nice to have you here to verify it. About the Besser family now, establishing here, did they homestead?
Yes, sir, they did. Now, I'm Mrs. Merle Zickafoos. You call me Frances.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. I did make an error there. This is Mrs. Merle Zickafoos instead of Frances Zickafoos. It's kind of like the Swifts, Mrs. Zickafoos. We get so many of them, we can't quite get them all figured out. But do you recall the year that your immediate family homesteaded?
Well, no, they were in here before the strip opened.
Well, we had some discussion about that a little while ago, and Mr. Stoneman referred to them as Sooner Towns. I guess they were established in a Sooner Town and was ready to make the run in 1893.
Well, probably so.
They
now,
lived down about Red Fork then, Adrian.
The Besser family.
Besser family, the old man was a doctor, and they used to come by where we was camped out here, coming up to doctor this old ranchman. The first I seen of them about 1891 or 2 for when I got acquainted with Bill Besser.
Oh, that's good.
Just kids.
Very good. Well, then going from this authentic history of the first white child that was born in the present city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, well, I'd like to get back then to the law enforcement in the early day. Do any of you recall any of the early time peace officers? We hadn't had time to discuss this, but I just wonder if any of you recall the
C.C.
name.
Marshall was,
What's the name, all right?
C.C. Marshall.
C.C. Marshall. Now, was he a United States Marshal or?
No, he was,
That was his name.
was he?
That was his name, Marshall.
Well,
He was sheriff
He
of
was
Pawnee
sheriff.
County.
The name was
C. Marshall.
C.C. Marshall, and he was a sheriff of Pawnee County.
Excuse me for putting in there.
Yeah, that's,
Well, at the time, I think you'll recall at the time they killed the bank robber down here.
that's right.
Do you remember about what year that was? I recall that Joe Weirman was in on this, on the capturing or the killing of that. I don't mean to imply that he shot the bank robber, but I was trying to recall the year that took place. How old were you?
About 1919.
About 1919.
That's right.
And because I remember that Joe Weirman told me about that affair, and it pretty nearly put a stop to the bank robbing down in this part of the country for a while. But who was a deputy marshal? Did you have a deputy marshal in here then, a deputy sheriff?
Delano was one of them.
Delano.
Yeah, he lived over in here, but I think I missed that about 5 years. Anyway.
Well, it boils down to the fact that the early day peace was pretty well kept by the good citizens of the community, doesn't it?
Yeah, about
C.C. Marshall was the sheriff here at that time.
yeah, he was a marshal. I saw him and Delano coming down here when they come down. I didn't know what was up till it was all over.
Well, I have one question I'd like to ask of Ms. Zickfoos. Are you still living on some of the homestead property?
No, I'm living out by Senate on the Sycamores.
Well, wasn't that area right in there originally settled by some of the Zickfoos family that homesteaded?
Well, no.
No, I believe Lacey.
Oh, Lacey. Mm-hmm.
Just don't know. Charlie had the place right
Yeah.
where she was out a while, but he didn't
Yeah,
homestead
but,
that. He lived down here, you know, at the bottom first.
What was Lacey's name? Do you remember? Walt.
Walt Lacey.
That's right.
Uh-huh. Well, I was trying to establish if any of our present day people were living on any of the original homesteads, excuse me. Then we'll go to the next point of the...
Adrian,
Yes, sir.
excuse me for butting in. As far as I know, my brother lives on the old homestead that my father got in '93. Only one that I know of in the family at
What's his
Hailstone. Oh, yes, that's right. Hale lives on the old homestead. He sure does. That's over in section 28, 20 north, 9 east.
Yeah.
I believe that's the only one. Do you recall anyone else, Archie?
No, I don't know of one that's alive or one that's in the family. Do you are?
No, I don't know.
Is anyone living on your old original homestead, Mr. Duff?
No.
Well, then, let's try to establish which of the two railroads was first built in this area. Was it the Katy on the north of the Arkansas or the Frisco on the south of the Cimarron and Arkansas?
No comment from me.
Do you remember which one was built first, Ara?
I'm pretty sure the Katy were on the north side of the river.
Built north to Osage.
That's right.
That's what we call Osage Junction.
Yeah.
Tell them then.
You remember anything, Mr. Duff?
Yeah, the Katy was built first. We could see them building it from our homestead.
That was in about what year?
Well, it must have been about 1903 along there someplace. That's when about.
Do you remember that scene, Salina?
I certainly do. Was only one place on our farm that we could see this train when it went by after they got it built. And if we were eating dinner or anything, we all jumped and run, and we would have to go a quarter of a mile to get to see this train go by. And then we'd go back and finish our dinner after the train went by.
You remember how many coaches was on it?
Oh, they used to be about 20, something like that. But we'd hear that thing
You
whistling.
mean people or coaches?
Just coaches. No, it was a freight train.
Oh, freight.
Just an old freight train, but oh my, that was something for
And
us
people
to
rode
see.
in perhaps a single coach behind the freight train.
Why, yes. Well, no, they rode in the caboose.
The caboose.
Yes.
Uh-huh. Do you remember that, Miss Stevens, or
No,
anything about that?
I don't remember that, but I remember when they brought the Frisco through here. I was very small and remember they had a big dinner on the ground that day. And when they got the train tracked it before it got to Keystone, you know.
Uh-huh.
Of course, it was a rubber train. And the reason I remember so well is everyone took their dinner and went down there and had a big dinner, you know, just celebrating and putting in on the train.
Oh, yes, well, that pretty well put an end to the ferries then that we've been talking about so much today. All right, now, let us get on one other very important subject that we mustn't overlook. Do any of you recall the establishment of the first church of any denomination in the community, or the immediate form area? The church is a very essential part of community life, and we don't want to skip that.
The little Baptist church across the river, I believe, was the first one that was
The
established.
one where Boone lives now.
Where David Boone lives now it was the old
It's a Union church. Everybody built it.
The community
Community
church.
church. That's right.
That's right.
non-denominational.
If everybody just pitched in and helped build it.
I remember long years ago when I first came here, there was a bell over that building.
Yes.
Am I right about
That's
that, or am I
right.
imagining
Oh,
something?
yes.
I
They
took
did
it,
have a
I
bell
took it,
over
I
there.
took it down.
Is that so? Well, that's good.
Turn that off a little bit, Adrian.
All right, we'll shut her down for just a moment. Are you ready to record now? We'll throw a little space in this thing, but it doesn't matter. In going back to the discussion of the early day on the church establishment, you've mentioned that at one time they held church here in a saloon building. Now you go ahead and tell us the story on that as best you can recall it, Art, and about where it's located with relation to Bill Kurtz's garage now.
I wouldn't know just where this first meeting was held, but it was around where Bill's garage is, or right across on across the street. There's 2 or 3 saloons there, you remember, in there, and I don't know just which one it was. Mrs. O'Keefe says it was in on the west side where they had their school, so I guess that's where the first church was held, probably right where the garage is now.
Then, do any of you have any recollection of the story that's been told so many times about the bootleggers in the area, or let us say saloon keepers? We couldn't legitimately call them bootleggers in that day and time because I guess it was legal here, making considerable contribution to the building of the first church on the south side.
Yes, there was, the old timers told me to give me a kind of a rap by the side how much they donated to the church whenever they got behind, where they went down to these boys in the whiskey business and they got relief, and us old boys farmed and run cattle while we didn't donate so much, so I don't know whether we stood as high as the whiskey men, so you figure that out now.
Anything to add to that, Art?
No.
How is that, all right? Is that about the way you hear it?
Yeah.
Well, say it to him then.
Salina, do you remember anything in connection with the...
No, I don't think so. That's about what I know about it.
Now, Miss
Well,
Stevens?
and now the first doctor or preacher I remember, I was very small, and he was a doctor and a preacher and a drunkard. So he would preach, and then he'd tell them not to do as he did, but do as he told them to do. And his name was Dr. Glenn. And,
Well, that was a good admonition at least, wasn't it?
But he would get just as drunk, and then he'd get up and preach and tell them not
I
to
don't know
do as
where
he
you-
did, but do as he told
I
them to do.
think that's that
That's very good.
ring ring the
I
bell.
see Mr. Stoneman and Mr. Stevens over here kind of collaborating on something. What have you got to add to this, Art? Let's get everything in here that we can, because this is the interesting part of it.
All right, you take it.
Go ahead.
I don't know, speaking about this, Glenn rings a bell way back there, but I won't tell you what made me think of it just now. She's told you pretty well about it, I guess. He was, lived up around Senate, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Oh, yeah.
Did he?
You mean his home was up about
He
Senate?
stayed up about Senate.
And he was a doctor and a preacher.
Mm-hmm.
Well then, do any of you recall about what time or what year the doctor at Senate, the name has slipped my mind for the moment, the old doctor up at Senate.
Fleming.
Dr. Fleming, sure. What year did Dr. Fleming first come in here?
He practiced up there at Senate in 1902.
In 1902.
1902.
And his boy, James Fleming, is now living on his old home place.
No.
No?
It's one he bought after he was here a long time.
Oh, yes, uh-huh.
But
Well,
he lived at Cleveland, and he rode a horse from down there to our place. We lost my brother down there, and he was a doctor in 1902. When he
in
passed.
1902 when
Yeah.
Dr. Fleming first came here.
Yeah, he lived at Cleveland.
You remember anything in particular about Dr. Fleming, Ms. Zickerfood?
Yes, sir, I remember about Dr. Fleming, but I don't remember when he lived at Keystone. He lived at Senate when I remember him. He was our doctor.
Mhm.
was
Well,
his first
I don't
name?
know that he ever lived in
No,
Keystone,
he
did he?
lived in Keystone.
At Senate.
He always lived at Senate, as
Yes.
best
Yeah.
we seem to establish. Well, I recall Dr. Fleming very well.
What was his name?
J.R.
Dr. J.R. Fleming. That was James's father.
That's right.
Because 35 years ago, when I first came to Keystone, we moved a rig in on the old Sherman Ackley homestead and drilled a well. And I'm going to inject this little bit of a story here because it's all true. And that was along about the time when the Rio Grande Valley became very popular, and everyone in this country was talking about going down to the Rio Grande Valley and buying a fruit farm or establishing themselves there for the great benefits of the year-round growth of fruits and vegetables. And I recall very well that Mr. Ackley had that dream in mind that if we got a well on his farm, that he was going to buy a farm in the Rio Grande Valley. So one afternoon, you know, we worked 12-hour towers then, Arch, you and I and all you fellas remember the hours we worked on drilling tools then. And about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we drilled into a big gas well. I recall that it blew the formation from which it was producing up onto the derrick floor and covered it a foot deep on the old standard nail derrick floor. Well, we didn't have any telephones, of course, and we drove to work in a buckboard buggy. So the crew took the buggy and drove back into town after we got on tower. You remember how we used to do that, Art?
That's right.
So I walked down to Sherman Ackley's farm place to report that we had drilled into this gas well, and it was a very sizable well. It was blowing a lot of gas. So I knocked on the door, and Mrs. Ackley came to the door, and I told her that we drilled into a big gas well. And I recall as vividly as though it were yesterday that she looked at me and she said, "No, you surely you haven't found oil and gas on our place, have you?" And I said, "Yes, we have, and I wanted to borrow a horse to ride into Keystone to where we could call the company and report to the well." And instead of Mrs. Ackley telling me that I could have a horse or anything at all, she dashed back into the house and got a shawl and put it over her shoulders, and she broke and ran all the way to the well, and I followed her. She just wouldn't believe what I was telling her. She wanted to see it. And when she got to the well, she stood there and watched that gas blowing out, and then Mr. Ackley came up before very long, and he said, "Well, I'll get my fruit farm after all in the Rio Grande." So that is a story from way back on the drilling of a wildcat well on the old Sherman Ackley homestead in, I don't remember the section, but anyhow it's a little northwest of Keystone and 20 North 9 East. So,
What year was that, Mr. Squibb?
oh, I'd have to figure it back right hurriedly. It's been about 35 years ago. What else do we have to take up? That's right.
That's all right now.
Okay. Now we have another to add to our discussion group. This is Grant Jones, and I've known Grant for a good many years. Grant, how old are you now? You mind me asking that question?
94 in August.
94 in August. And what year did you come to Keystone, Grant?
In when I was 44 years old in November.
That'd be 1907.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. You came here from Park Hill, didn't you?
No. I came here first, and I bought a drugstore over on the other side of the river.
Over in Appalachia.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to move away from there, and I moved over here, and
You came back to the south side of the river.
yeah. I came back because the post office is over here and the railroad.
Mm-hmm.
And
Established a drugstore.
I was here about 4 years, or 5, something like that, and I moved my store over to Old Park Hill.
Oh, you went to Park Hill after you came to Keystone.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And that was when I was 52 years old, I left Park Hill. And that'd be about 39 years ago in the 40s.
Mm-hmm. Then how long did you stay at Park Hill before you came back to Keystone? 3 years. And you've been here ever since.
And I came back here and I bought Dr. Woodard out.
Dr. Woodard. Was that Chick Woodard's father?
No.
That was Chick Woodard's father.
Yeah.
And he owned a livery stable here, didn't he? You recall that, Mr. Stevens, that Chick Woodard's father had a livery stable here in Keystone at one time?
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Art says that. You remember that too, I guess, Art? And you...
Yeah, a fellow by the name of Marshall owned that. That's where this drugstore is now. He was an old wooden building,
Uh-huh.
and he had a livery stable there.
Then what
Marshall.
year did you buy the property where your home is up by Will Chesley?
I don't remember, but it was,
You remember what year Will Chesley came here? Did he come here
he
with
was
Frank?
here when I came.
Did he come here with
He
his brother
didn't.
Frank?
Yeah.
Well, that'd be along about 1903, as best we've been able to establish.
Well, I guess I was here.
Well, Grant, you knew Will Chesley, of course. Did you ever know Frank?
Yeah, I knew him after I came here, but not before.
Mm-hmm.
Nor Will either.
Mm-hmm.
Where was he from? Where was he from? What state?
You mean
Yes.
what state did you come here from, Grant?
I came from Kansas down here, but my native state was Illinois.
Mm-hmm. You came over into what town in Kansas from Illinois?
Mulvane. It was 16 miles down the river on the east side of the Arkansas River on the high ground like Chelsea is now.
Uh-huh. What's the name of the town?
Mulvane.
Mulvane, Kansas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The old lawyer, his name was Mulvane, that built the road.
Mm-hmm. Well, Grant, my tape is just about gone, and I'm sure glad you come in early enough to get your recording on this thing, because we'll have to shut it down now. My tape is just about run out. And thank you very much, Grant Jones. Lolita, you take this and go ahead with the significance of the establishment of the name of Keystone as a town.
Several months ago, Daddy Jones came by one morning and asked me if I knew how Keystone happened to be named. Of course, I didn't know, and he has told me the most interesting story. And I'd like him to tell that story again. Daddy Jones, would you tell us again how Keystone happened to be named?
That's all right.
Well, that town of Appalachia over there was started before Keystone did.
Yes, that's right.
And there's no man lived down on the river down a river drive. His name was I can't remember names anymore.
Well, what
Dr.
did-
Reeder was the one who named the town, as you told me, Daddy Jones.
Well, I was coming to that.
Yes.
I came here and I bought Burton, a store, Doc Burton. He was over on the other side of the river. In that first house on the street that runs west. And I came here on borrowed money. I borrowed $60. And I came to Muskogee.
Well, when did you meet Dr. Reeder first, Grant?
Reader?
Yeah, Dr. Reeder, when he told you about why he was naming the town, now what was it he said about that?
I
About
said
naming
we'll call it Keystone.
Uh-huh. And why did he call it Keystone? Do you remember what he said about that?
Well, it was the shape of the mountain here passed through this river. This Cimarron River came down here and turned and went around through that lake over there, and then down past.
It was a dividing line, wasn't it, of the 4 counties? The Keystone for the dividing line of Creek County, Osage County, Tulsa County, and Pawnee County. But then he had an emblem of some kind that he wore. What significance does that have to naming it Keystone?
Ooh,
Dr. Reeder wore an emblem, a Masonic emblem of some kind.
yes, the Keystone is well, you know the shape of it. It's the last crowning stone that is put on the temple.
And that's why Dr. Reeder called it Keystone, isn't
Yeah,
it? Because of that Masonic emblem.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Grant. That's what we wanted, and thank you very, very much.